Good evening and welcome to this fourth in this fall's series, Tuohy series. Tonight, Fault Lines in the New Testament. Please welcome again Father Smiga.
Thanks, David, and thanks to all of you for coming again. I see many familiar faces. That's a good thing. For those of you, and I do see some new faces, just a very brief overview of where we've been. We started in the first lecture about talking how we have no direct contact with God, and there is no direct examination of God possible. And so we are limited in our understanding of God to use images that have been passed down to us by other people of faith. The Fourth Lateran Council has said that these images are very limited. They are more dissimilar than similar to the way that God is. Nevertheless, it is by holding on to images such as God as Father, God as Creator, God as Savior, that we are able to have any relationship with God. In the second lecture of the series, we talked about how the Christian image of God comes primarily from the Jewish people, and how over a period of 1,200 years, the Jewish people created a portrait of God as one who saves, creates, listens, expects, and restores. And last week, we said with that substantial inheritance from Judaism, how does Christ fit into this? And does Christ fundamentally shift or change the portrait of God that Christians use today? And our conclusion was that when you go back to the earliest proclamation of the gospel, that the role of Christ was not primarily centered upon who he was, that is, whether he was divine or human or both, but about what he accomplished, what he did, and that it was, in the opinion of the early Christians, certainly the opinion of Paul, that it was the God of Israel who had now acted through Christ as the Messiah to begin the restoration of creation. And since last week, I've got the most response on my sort of cheesy tactic of trying to put a number on how much of the present Christian view of God or portrait of God is Jewish. And if you remember in my hubris last week, I suggested 85% of the Christian view of God remains a Jewish portrait. Now, people have talked to me and said, oh, that's much too high. And others have said, oh, no, I think it's a little low. We should bring it up a little bit. But the point is, and this is where the cheesiness comes in, is that it engages us to think how much indebtedness do we have to the Jewish tradition, and how much of our present view of God still remains a Jewish portrait of God. So the bottom line of all of this is whether you want to put it at 85% or 75% or 93%, a significant amount of the way that we see God, a significant amount of the images that we are still dependent on to see God comes from the Jewish tradition. And so the question that we're facing tonight is, if we're at least in that ball field of 85%, how come no one knows this? And how come Christians today continue to sort of move ahead imagining that what Jesus revealed to us is a new picture of God, as opposed to a consistent picture of God that comes from the Hebrew Scriptures? And that leads us to the topic for tonight, which is shifting the context, fault lines in the New Testament. Because I'm going to argue tonight that there were a number of factors when the authors of the New Testament wrote the works that they did, which let the works of the New Testament, or gave the New Testament works, certain fault lines, certain potential breaking points that when they were shifted to new contexts, in fact, did break and caused much of the distortion of the picture that we have today between Jews and Christians. So tonight we're going to look at what these fault lines are. There's a tremendous amount of research that has been done in this area. So I'm going to be pretty broad and summarize, but as you'll see, we're going to come down with three factors that I think we can say are primarily the cause of the fault lines in the New Testament. So let's start with this. And it's a fact that often we don't reflect upon. Jesus was Jewish. So were his entire family and all of his disciples during his ministry. The great apostles of the first generation of Christians were either Jewish, like Paul, or familiar enough with Judaism to understand it as the essential context of the gospel. The God of Israel was the foundation of the good news concerning Jesus. The early missionaries of Christ knew this. Without the images of God which Israel had accumulated, the Christian message, the Christian gospel, was incomplete. The Jewish scriptures, that is, the law, the prophets, and the writings, were the scriptures for the early followers of Jesus. When Paul writes his letters and he talks about the scriptures, he's talking about what we now call the Old Testament. Because the first Christians expected Jesus to return soon in glory, they saw at the beginning no need to add to the Jewish scriptures. Their proclamation was oral, it was forceful but fleeting. It was sufficient for them to announce that God's final act had begun and the fullness of the kingdom would soon arrive. But Christ's return did not occur as soon as it had been expected. Months of waiting turned into years. The witnesses to Christ's resurrection began to die. Christians recognized the need to capture their proclamation in a permanent written form. Therefore, early letters from apostles such as Paul were collected. New works were composed based on the ministry of Jesus. And by the 2nd century, this emerging collection began to take a recognizable shape. In time, 27 works, mostly letters and gospels, would be recognized as the authoritative list of Christian writings. Tertullian, a Christian of the 2nd century, provided the name which Christians continue to use for this new sacred collection. He calls it the New Testament. The name distinguishes the Christian collection from the Jewish scriptures, which had been the original inspired writings of the church. The Jewish scriptures in this process were also renamed. Christians began to refer to them as the Old Testament. Now, the New Testament writers never intended that their works should stand in isolation from the Jewish scriptures. Their writings testified to the great act of salvation which God had initiated in Christ. They proclaimed the final act of God revealed to Israel, the God who had begun the restoration of creation. In proclaiming that ultimate act, they presumed the beginning. There was no need to do what had already been done, to redraw the portrait of God which Israel had built. In this sense, the New Testament depends upon the Old. When the New Testament is read without the knowledge of the Jewish scriptures, it is incomplete. It is the ending of a story whose characters have no history or grounding. Now, ignoring the beginning of a story is problematic, and I'd like to give you just a commonplace example. Suppose you were presented with the last 5 paragraphs of O. Henry's famous short story, The Gift of the Magi. In those paragraphs, if you read them, you'd be able to see a number of things. You would be able to read how Della presents her husband, Jim, with his Christmas present. And that Christmas present would be a new chain for his pocket watch. You could read how Jim informs his wife that he no longer has the watch because he sold it to buy her Christmas present, a beautiful set of tortoise-shell combs to wear in her hair. Jim then stretches out on the couch and tells his wife to put the gifts away and prepare dinner. And O. Henry concludes the story with a final paragraph in which he compares this young couple to the Magi who brought their gifts to the infant Jesus. He tells the readers that of all of those who gave gifts that Christmas, this couple was the wisest. Now, when you read these last 5 paragraphs alone, apart from the rest of the story, they make some sense. But much remains perplexingly unclear. Why are these two the wisest of all givers? Their gift exchange appears to be a catastrophe. Jim receives a gift which is useless because he no longer owns a watch. In order to understand what's going on, we need the beginning of the story to understand the ending. The beginning tells us that the combs which Jim bought for Della are themselves useless because Della had cut her hair and sold it to purchase the watch chain. The beginning also informs us of the poverty of this couple and how the sale of Jim's watch and Della's hair were not casual decisions, but heartbreaking choices to sacrifice what was most dear for the sake of the other. You see, it's only when you have the entire story that you can appreciate the potent irony which reveals that combs and watch chains are but the story's veneer. The real gift is the sacrifice and the commitment of this couple whose cross-purposed plans and exchanges could not be destroyed. The ending by itself cannot carry the irony, nor the tragedy, nor the beauty of their love. The New Testament is the ending of a larger story. Its constant references to the Jewish scriptures are not merely a matter of historical deference, acknowledging the origins out of which it emerged. They attest to the essential context of the gospel, the portrait of the God whose work they proclaim. A recent statement of the Catholic Pontifical Biblical Commission points to this truth forcibly. Without the Old Testament, the New Testament would be an incomprehensible book, a plant deprived of its roots and destined to dry up and wither. I think that's a very strong but accurate description of the situation. And so it was the intention of the earliest apostles to add their witness to the Hebrew Scriptures, to what we call the Old Testament, but not to move on or presume that they could understand their stories without it. Now, as Christianity began to spread into new contexts, the essential connection between the two testaments faded. The church was becoming increasingly Gentile, and the Jewish scriptures began to appear to Gentiles as unfamiliar literature. The ancestors, kings, and prophets of Israel, through whom the Christian portrait of God emerged, seemed foreign to non-Jewish Christians. Sophisticated Greeks were embarrassed by stories and laws and battles tied to a culture which they deemed inferior to their own. Therefore, new methods of interpretation were developed, which allowed the New Testament to be read in, quote, a more spiritual sense. Characters and events were valued not as revelation in their own right, but more as hints and shadows whose primary purpose was to point to Christ. These spiritual and allegorical methods became the primary way in which Christians read the Old Testament. Now, it must be said that the spiritual methods developed by Christians have validity. For after all, the end of the story, once you know it and accept it, can be recognized in the characters and movement which the earlier story contains. Because Christians believe that Christ is the end of the story, and because they also believe that the same God connects the two testaments, there is a validity for them to recognize intimations of Christ in the Old Testament. So Christians can and do read the Old Testament in light of Christ. But this one way of reading the Old Testament quickly became the only way Christians approached the Jewish scriptures. Soon, the only passages which had meaning for Christians were those that could be tied to Christ. The Old Testament was rapidly losing its status as revelation in its own right, and when this happened, the relationship between the two testaments was inverted. The end of the story was placed first. The plant demeaned its roots, regarding them as only a shadow. Now, although this was the development of the interpretation of the Hebrew Scriptures, it was something that the earliest authors never intended, the authors of the New Testament. In fact, an isolated reading of the New Testament was inconceivable to the authors of the New Testament. The Jewish scriptures were their inspired writings which provided the context for the Christian gospel. The New Testament authors simply presumed this context. But it was precisely because of this presumption that a vulnerability emerged within the New Testament. What was presumed did not have to be expressed. It was enough to imply the essential grounding of the message. And such presumptions and implications instilled fault lines within the New Testament. When then the New Testament was read outside of its original setting, such fault lines allowed later interpreters to read the New Testament in a manner unintended by its authors and contrary to its own story. Tonight, we're going to look at three factors which occasion these fault lines within the New Testament. The three factors are: Paul wrote letters, the Gospels were not just about Jesus, and Rome was dangerous. Those three factors shaped the New Testament in such a way that fault lines were included within it. So let's look at the first one. Paul wrote letters. The genuine writings of Paul are the earliest works in the New Testament. They offer a fresh and immediate access to the beliefs and enthusiasm of the early church. Their directness and urgency flow in large part from their literary form. Paul's letters are real letters. And a letter carries immediacy. You can read the words of the author unfiltered by literary artifice. You can enter a conversation. The problem with the letter is that it only gives you half of the conversation. You have immediate access to what the writer is saying, but the letter is often silent about the situation which is being addressed. Now, that situation, of course, would have been known and presumed by the original recipients of the letter. They knew what Paul was talking about, and this is why there was no need for Paul to restate it. The context and the issues of the letters could be presumed by Paul, because he already knew that he and those who received his letters knew what the issues were about which he was writing. The letter, however, because of this, places subsequent readers at a distinct disadvantage. They must surmise from clues within the letter what the original situation was. Letters provide one half of a real conversation. Subsequent readers must reconstruct what the original writers and addressees already knew. A simple way of saying like this is that reading Paul's letters is like reading somebody else's mail. You can get or listening to someone speak on a phone conversation. You're hearing half of the conversation, and you have to guess by what's being said what the issue is or what is known between the two parties that are having the conversation. So, this characteristic of letters, the fact that Paul wrote real letters, created a dangerous fault line in the New Testament. In his letters, Paul frequently speaks of the law. And as he speaks of the law, he frequently draws a contrast, a strong contrast between the law and faith in Christ. We're overhearing this conversation, and we know that Paul sees these as somehow contrasted to one another. Now, Paul never clearly defines what aspect of the law upsets him, or in what manner he sees it contrary to faith. Today, most Pauline scholars believe that Paul's objection to the law was narrow and specific. Paul was not objecting to the law itself or the law as it pertained to Jews. Paul's letters, after all, were addressed to Gentiles. And Paul's objection to the law was one which applied to Gentiles. We today assume that Paul was against applying certain requirements of the law, such as circumcision and food requirements, to his Gentile converts. In other words, Paul was not devising some grand theological position against the presumed evils of the law. He simply did not want his Gentile converts to be bound by certain requirements of the law. This narrow focus would have been understood by his original Gentile readers. When they heard Paul objecting to the law, they understood exactly what aspects of the law Paul had in mind, the aspects which applied to them. They knew this because the letter was addressed to them and to the circumstances which they already understood. The letter form presumed what the sender and the receivers already knew, and that is why Paul did not need to say more about it when he wrote the letter. Now, once we take Paul's letters out of their original context, once they became collected and a lot of other people started reading Paul's mail, the reason for his opposition to the law was no longer clear. New interpreters had to provide a rationale to explain why Paul was always speaking against the law. And this made Paul's writings notoriously difficult to understand. And it is perhaps for this reason that Paul's letters assumed a rather minor position in the New Testament and were largely overlooked for hundreds of years, even though they were always seen as scripture. Now, all of this changed at the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther found in Paul the center of the gospel. Building upon Paul's frequent statements against the law, Luther interpreted Paul's statements in a general and universal sense. He identified law with the human effort to earn God's favor through good works. Luther then understood the gospel as being the opposite of such human striving. The gospel was about accepting God's favor as a free gift, as a grace. The good news then was that God's favor could not be earned through works of the law, but only freely received. Paul's opposition to the law was read by Luther as the opposition between human works and grace. Now, Paul certainly believed that salvation was a free gift. He was a Jew, after all. He knew that Israel had not earned the covenant, but that it was given through God's free choice. For Paul, God's choice of Israel was what we as Christians call a grace. So was God's action in Christ. Both flowed from the consistent portrait of the God of Israel. Paul understood this consistency. Luther did not. When Luther read Paul attacking the law, he concluded that Paul was against earning salvation, and that Judaism was a religion trying to earn God's favor through human works. When Paul is interpreted in this way, Judaism becomes a legalistic religion which tries to relate to God through human merit. Because human striving and grace are opposed to each other, Luther concluded that Judaism and Christianity were opposed to each other for the same reason. In Luther's understanding, Christ's mission was contrary to Judaism and a corrective of it. Christ came to save humanity from dependence on the Jewish legal system and to offer a new way to God. Now, Luther's package was compelling. It fueled Christian preaching and spirituality for 500 years, asserting the primacy of God's grace. It was, however, built upon thin air. It conveniently ignored the reality that Judaism, neither at the time of Paul or today, ever thought it was possible to earn God's favor. The law was not a program for human accomplishment, but a response to God's love. Paul, who was both a Jew and a Pharisee, would have known this completely and presumed it when he wrote his letters. So we would imagine would be those whom he addressed in his letters. But the letter did not require the presumed to be expressed, and this left a gap of meaning within Paul's letters. Interpreters such as Luther exploited the gap, turning the law into legalism and Judaism into a religion of human achievement. Now we have to add here that Luther and those who followed them would have never suggested their understanding of Paul if they had read the Old Testament as revelation in its own right. The Old Testament contains the portrait of a God who expects, and the God who expects gave the law as a response to love. The Old Testament reveals that the God who expects is not controlled by human merit, but chose Israel freely, or as Christians would say, as an act of grace. Alas, By the time Luther wrote, the authoritative voice of the Old Testament had been reduced to a shadow, and the Christians were no longer on speaking terms with Jews, who could easily corrected the misperception. So Luther read the New Testament apart from the Old, and when it was necessary to provide a rationale for Paul's opposition to the law, he presumed that Paul saw the law as the enemy of grace. His presumption was wrong, but he could reach it because of a fault line in the New Testament which enabled an interpretation contrary to Paul's Jewish faith. Today, Christians continue to believe that God saves us in Jesus as a free gift. Paul would certainly agree with this belief, but it would be misleading for Christians to assume that God's grace began only with Jesus. Christ's work is a part of a consistent pattern of God, which began with Israel. Ignoring this continuity places the new covenant in opposition to the old covenant and gives Christianity an orientation at odds with Judaism. This opposition dissolves as soon as Christians realize that the God who freely saves us and expects our response in love is not a new revelation of Jesus. Those qualities of grace come to Christians as part of the Jewish portrait of God. So that's the first area that brings us to see fault lines in the New Testament. Paul wrote letters. A second fault line was introduced in the New Testament through the Gospels. The Gospels were not just about Jesus. They were also about the communities who wrote them. Gospels are not as immediate as letters. They do not demand that their readers be privy to the same amount of background information that letters require. A stage is set, characters are introduced in a way that speaks to any reader who picks up the text. Yet it would be wrong to assume that the Gospels are merely an impartial narrative of Jesus' life and ministry. The Gospels were local literature, written for specific communities. Each gospel tells the story of Jesus in terms which were relevant to its local church. The issues that were current in a local Christian community, such as Rome or Antioch, were written into the narration of Jesus' ministry. In other words, they included themes of their community as they told the story of Jesus. Now, the gospel writers adopted this approach in order to provide immediacy to the story and a strong connection to the lives of their audiences. Much like modern preachers, they did not simply recount historical memories of Jesus' life, but related them to the local contexts of their communities. Therefore, even though the Gospels are not as dependent on a presumed context as letters are, they still relate the story of Jesus in light of specific circumstances which would have been recognizable to the original audiences, but somewhat unclear to subsequent readers. Since all the Gospels were written decades after the events of Jesus' ministry, they include in their narration ideas and issues which were proper to that later time. The Gospel writers often color Jesus' opponents within the Gospels with characteristics which describe the struggles of their local communities. Thus, debates which were taking place many years after Jesus' death become part of the gospel narrative and appear to be a part of his earthly ministry. Each gospel has tailored its story to the local issues of its community. As effective as this technique was to enhance the relevance of the gospel to its original audiences, it introduced a significant fault line within the New Testament. We're going to take the Gospel of John as an example. Written over 60 years after Jesus' ministry, John, like all the Gospels, is a local document. John's community has been rejected by their neighborhood synagogue, probably because John's community was promoting an understanding of Jesus which the other synagogue members found too exalted. John's community wore its expulsion from the synagogue as a badge of honor. It understood its rejection as identification with its Lord. In John's gospel, Jesus speaks in light of this expulsion. He tells the Johannine community, "If they have persecuted me, they will persecute you." A persecution taking place at the end of the first century has been written into the narration of Jesus' ministry and the message of the gospel. And one of the things we have to admit here is that opposition, when people fought in the ancient world, they did not deem politeness a virtue. The writer of John's gospel rejects those who persecuted his community with all the force he can muster. The community's opponents are presented as Jesus' opponents. They are said to be in darkness, without the truth, excluded from life, and for good measure, children of the devil. And in one of the most faithful decisions of the New Testament, the Gospel of John chose a term to refer to this vilified group. The word in Greek is hoiudai. In the English translations of our Bibles, this term is usually translated the Jews. This gives to the contemporary reader of the gospel the suggestion that Jesus was opposed to his own people. Now, an attentive reading of the gospel demonstrates that the Jews in John's gospel simply cannot refer to all Jews. Take, for example, John's account of the first appearance of the risen Christ. The disciples are together, and the gospel reports that the doors of the place where they were gathered were locked for fear of the Jews. Historically, such a statement is ludicrous. If they were locking the Jews out, who had they locked in? Everyone in the room was Jewish. Jesus was Jewish, and so were all the disciples of his ministry. For that matter, it's also very likely that the community of John's gospel was Jewish. The gospel would never include Jesus or his disciples or its own community as part of the rejected Jews, and his original readers would have known this. Their awareness is what allowed the author of the gospel to use a general term, the Jews, to refer to some subgroup smaller than all the Jews. It is probable that this subgroup was the particular Jews who excluded the community of John from the synagogue. And when the original readers of the gospel heard the Jews, they understood those particular Jews, the subset of Jews whose John's community hated. That hatred is what caused the gospel writer to make them the opponents of Jesus and call them children of the devil. Now, when the original readers read their gospel, they would have understood the specific group which this use of the Jews indicated. Moreover, they would have appreciated it. In their gospel, Jesus was standing with them in opposition to the group which had rejected them. There is no question that the use of the Jews made the Gospel of John particularly relevant and effective to its original audience. When, however, this gospel was included as part of the New Testament, the local became universal. new readers identifying with Jesus as the hero would see him opposing not some subset of Jews, but all Jews. What was clear in the original context of the gospel was forgotten. Subsequent generations of Christians began to see Jesus in opposition to his own people. Now, subsequent Christians would have never come to this conclusion had the Old Testament been read as revelation in its own right. If the personal and faithful and saving and restoring God of the Jews had been fully appreciated as the Father of Jesus, Jesus' own connection to Judaism could not have been so easily discarded. The Old Testament reveals that God is faithful to the Jewish covenant. But the New Testament had in practice been severed from the Old and been made the interpretive key of all that the Jewish scriptures contain. Since all authority had been given to the New Testament, the opposition between Jesus and the Jews in the Gospel of John could somehow be accepted as paradigmatic of the entire Bible. The Jewish Messiah could be pictured as standing against the Jewish people. The last factor that we want to look at tonight, this last fault line in the New Testament, does not result from any literary characteristics, but rather from historical realities. It stands as a scar within our Bibles, not because the New Testament was read apart from the Old, but because it was read in a particular cultural setting. The fault emerges not from what the text presumes, but what it fears. It fears the Roman Empire. Rome was dangerous. And that fear can best be explained through two images which still resonate today: the eagle and the cross. The eagle was the sign of Roman power. It stood atop military standards which Roman legions carried into battle. Under the eagle was often placed an image of the emperor who directed the Roman war machine. Now, today, Americans view the eagle as a positive symbol, associating it with the power of a democratic nation. At its best, that power is subservient to the wishes of the people and serves the ideals of freedom and justice. It would be understandable if Americans were to suppose that the Roman eagle represented a similar understanding of power. Think again. For all its philosophical and artistic accomplishments, the Roman Empire ruled with brutal force. It is possible to identify some ancient regimes which were more violent than Rome, but the romanticized picture of Rome, promoted by the Roman poet Virgil and Hollywood spectaculars, too easily passes over the cruelty and the oppression of the empire. Rome ruled with the force of its legions and the fear they inspired. That ruthless force was particularly apparent in Rome's history with the Jews. The Jews were notorious throughout the empire for their willingness to challenge the Roman eagle. They also became the example for what subjected peoples could expect if the eagle was aroused. After the death of Herod the Great, about 4 BCE, we imagine, the Roman historian Flavius Josephus reports that thousands of disturbances broke out in Judea and Galilee. They thought, the tyrant's dead, let's see what we can get out of this. The Roman governor at the time, who was in Syria, was a man by the name of Publius Quintilius Varus, and he was responsible for order in the region. So Varus entered Galilee with 2 Roman legions and 4 troops of horsemen, gathering additional armed men from cities along the way. He sent a portion of the army under the general Caius to the Galilean city of Sepphoris, where Judah, son of Hezekiah, had instigated a rebellion. Caius looted the city and burnt it to the ground. All of its inhabitants were sold into slavery. Varus himself continued on to Jerusalem. He gathered from the countryside those who were involved in the uprising and put them to death. Josephus again tells us that he crucified 2,000 people. Roman power had been challenged. Its response was swift. Its instrument was the cross. Now, the city of Sepphoris was located only 4 miles from Nazareth, the town of Jesus. It was destroyed about the time of Jesus' birth. As Jesus grew up in Galilee, there can be no doubt that the story of Caius' action was retold time and again in his hometown. The man who would die on the cross some 30 years later was aware from his earliest years of the power of Rome. Now, the most devastating encounter between Jews and Roman power began in the year 66 of the Common Era. Then Jews took up arms against the Roman garrison stationed in Jerusalem. The Syrian legate at this time was another man by the name of Cestius Gallus, and he attempted to restore order with Rome's 12th Legion. He was soundly defeated by the rebels, and the Roman eagle of the legion was captured. This was a big no-no. You don't capture the Roman eagle, okay? The Emperor Nero responded immediately, sending the Roman general Vespasian to crush the uprising. Jerusalem was surrounded, and a 3-year siege was begun. Cut off from supplies of food and water, Jerusalem became a city of death. People tried to flee, but Vespasian gave the orders that anyone caught fleeing the city would be crucified facing the city walls. By the end of the siege, tens of thousands of crucified bodies encircled Jerusalem. Upon Nero's death, Vespasian became emperor, and it fell to his son Titus to complete his father's assignment. The walls of Jerusalem were finally breached in 70 of the Common Era, and the entire city was sacked and burned. Those who did not die by starvation or disease were put to death by the invading Romans. Again, we're dependent here upon Josephus's report, but Josephus reports that the bodies of the dead were piled so high in the streets that you couldn't pass through the streets of the city, and that blood flowed so freely that it extinguished many of the homes which were on fire. Now, that could be a little hyperbole there, but you wouldn't want to be in the city, let's put it that way. Over 1 million people were killed in the siege of Jerusalem. 97,000 were captured and sold into slavery. Nor was there any sense of magnanimity in victory. Titus condemned 2,500 captive Jews to die in the amphitheater of Caesarea. The slaughter was arranged as a celebration of his brother Domitian's birthday. After the Temple of Jerusalem had been leveled and burnt, the Roman legions set their military standards at what was once the eastern gate of the temple. The eagle was planted in the ashes of the temple. Rome was victorious. For the rest of the century, Roman emperors would strike coins touting their victory. The emperor's image was on the face of the coin. This particular coin shows you the face of Vespasian. The reverse displayed a bound Jewish captive by a palm tree with a seated Jewish woman in mourning. The inscription on the coin read, Judea Capta, which is translated Judea conquered. Jews had experienced the consequences for challenging Roman power. They would never forget the devastation. Neither would the early Christians who at this time began to write the story of Jesus' death. It's true to say that the early Christian movement collided with the Roman eagle because of the cross of Jesus. Today, the cross has become a commonplace symbol of Christianity. It adorns the tips of soaring steeples. It hangs decoratively on golden chains and bracelets. It appears in Easter lawn displays, gaily constructed out of pastel eggshells. The modern world has domesticated the cross, reducing it to an ornament. In the ancient world, it was a horror, the instrument of an unspeakable death. Crucifixion was first practiced by the Persians and Phoenicians, but it was perfected by the Romans. It became a principal tool of their power. Crucifixion damaged no vital part of the body. The person was affixed to a wooden beam by nails and ropes. Naked and immobile, the one crucified was exposed to heat, cold, and insects. Death from hunger, thirst, and suffocation came slowly, taking often days. The Romans saw crucifixion not simply as a physical torture. It was a propaganda tool meant to send a message. Bodies were often left on the cross for days after death. The carrion birds which fed on them helped to communicate to the populace what would result from challenging the Roman eagle. In the ancient world, the most well-known fact concerning Jesus of Nazareth was that he had died by crucifixion. Such notoriety was no advantage to the early church. A Messiah who was crucified was an incongruent message. It was difficult to swallow that an executed criminal, publicly shamed and tortured, was God's agent for the new creation. This embarrassment over the crucified Lord is the best explanation why Christians produced no religious images of Jesus' crucifixion for the first 400 years of their history. We have no representation of Jesus' crucifixion for the first 400 years of Christianity. The earliest representation we have is from 432 of the Common Era. It is a wood carving of a bearded Jesus crucified between two thieves, and it can be found on the doors of Santa Sabina in Rome. If you ever go to Rome, go to see Santa Sabina. You can walk right up to the doors. They're still the doors of the church, and these doors are from 432 BC of the Common Era. You can see this carving of Jesus' crucifixion. So as far as we know, this is the first example of a representation of Jesus crucified in Christian art. There is, however, one earlier image of Jesus' crucifixion which has come down to us. It cannot be included as a devotional artifact because it is a religious slur devised by a teenage boy. In 1857, excavations were underway on the Palatine Hill in Rome. Since the time of Augustus, the Palatine was the location of the emperor's palace, and a succession of emperors built and rebuilt and extended a vast complex of imperial buildings. During the excavations of the 19th century, a building was unearthed which had been sealed for over 1,700 years. It was identified as a pedagogium, a school for imperial page boys. What archaeologists had discovered was the 2nd century equivalent of an English boarding school. One wall on this building displayed an image dating from the 1st or 2nd century. It had been etched into the plaster by a sharp stone or sliver of iron. The image was recognized as a graffito, the singular of the more common word graffiti, an ancient drawing related to the spray-painted statements which today so frequently appear on our abandoned buildings and freeway underpasses. The content and the purpose of the graffito confirm that teenage schoolboys have not changed much over the centuries. They know how to locate the most vulnerable aspects of their classmates for ridicule. The competitive pack is quick to select the boy who can be tagged as a loser and stigmatized accordingly. The graffito discovered in 1857 had been directed to one such boy. His name was Alexamenos, and the reason for the insult was his religion. Alexamenos was a Christian. Here's a clearer drawing of that graffito, which is hard to see. And you can see Alexamenos appearing in the graffito in the stance of adoration, gazing upward towards a human-like figure attached to a cross. It is clear that the graffito mocks Alexamenos because the figure on the cross possesses the head of an ass. An inscription, and it's kind of like pretty primitive Greek, but an inscription below the scene reads, Alexamenos worships his God. Kids can be cruel. Alexamenos might have been a good student and a pleasant boy, but he was vulnerable because his Lord had been crucified. Jesus' crucifixion was an obstacle to the spread of Christianity. It opened the gospel to ridicule. When such a weakness could filter down to the mockery of pubescent schoolboys, the perception was clearly widespread. But crucifixion was not only an embarrassment, it was also a danger. A crucified Savior could easily send the wrong message. Remember, crucifixion was Rome's response to insurgency. The one crucified would easily be identified as a rebel. So imagine a potential convert to Christianity being presented with the gospel after the violent destruction of Jerusalem. Crucifixion would associate Jesus with all the crucified Jews who took up arms against Rome and faced the vengeance of Titus. With a Judea capta coin in his pocket, the possible convert would weigh carefully whether he would want to have any association with the Christian movement. Accepting Jesus as Messiah could easily be interpreted as a challenge to Rome. All four Gospels of the New Testament were written during or after the siege and destruction of Jerusalem. The earliest Gospel, Mark, was written about 68 of the Common Era, at the very time that the bodies of thousands of Jews were hanging on crosses around the holy city. The evangelists understood that as they put the story of Jesus' death into writing, it was important to disassociate Jesus, who was crucified decades earlier, from the revolutionaries who had supported the disastrous war against Rome. Their desire to protect the gospel from such an association inclined all four gospels to reduce Roman responsibility for Jesus' death. They were highly motivated to do so. Now, historically, there is little doubt that it was Roman power exercised under the prefect Pontius Pilate which crucified Jesus. Very likely some of the Jewish temple authorities were involved in the process, but it was a Roman official who rendered a Roman sentence and prescribed a Roman form of execution. This much Roman involvement was dangerous for the evangelists. The spotlight was too much on Pilate. Jesus could too easily be seen as an enemy of the empire. The evangelists downplayed Roman involvement in Jesus' death, and in doing so, they increased Jewish responsibility. They presented the Jewish leaders as the moving force behind Jesus' crucifixion. The Gospels portrayed the Jewish authorities as plotting against Jesus. They make up false charges about him. They bring him before Pilate and demand his death. As responsibility is shifted to Jewish agents, Pilate becomes almost marginal in the proceedings. The story implies that he was innocent, that his hand was forced. To imagine the historical Pontius Pilate being forced into anything is a real stretch. Pilate was nobody's puppet. Pilate had the power and the will to remove Jewish high priests who would not cooperate with his agenda, and he did so often. Historians of Pilate's time report several incidents where Pilate used manipulation and force to compel the Jewish leadership to comply to his will. He met a challenge with a counter-challenge. He frequently employed coercion to attain results. When he was finally removed from his office as prefect, many years after Jesus' crucifixion, it was not because of indecision. He was called back to Rome because he used excessive brutality in subduing a Samaritan disturbance. Now, Pilate appears a very different person in the Gospels. He is indecisive and a wimp. Even though he believes Jesus is innocent, he cannot find the resolve to set him free. He is caught off guard and undone by the Jewish leadership. We can only conclude that the presentation of Pilate in the Gospels is not an accurate rendering of the real man. His character has been softened and sanitized to be an implicit, though ineffective, supporter of Jesus. The change was intentional. It allowed any reader of the Gospels to understand that the crucifixion of Jesus was not the result of his opposition to the power of Rome. The Gospels imply that the crucifixion was instigated by Jewish leadership who sought his death for religious reasons, and that the Roman prefect actually wished to set Jesus free. A prospective convert to Christianity would be comforted by this news. It made it clear that Christianity was not opposing the empire. The sympathy for Pilate in the Gospels was not lost on later Christians. Tertullian described Pilate as, quote, a Christian at heart. And the Ethiopian Christian church made Pilate and his wife saints, giving them a day for veneration on June 19th. It's one of the interesting things you find for coming to the lecture. You can celebrate Pilate's feast day on June 19th. The amelioration of Pilate within the Gospels reduced Roman responsibility for Jesus' death. It inserted, however, a serious fault line within the New Testament. There is no compelling reason to believe that the Gospel shifted the presentation of Jesus' death out of hatred for Jews. The new slant was to protect the Christian movement from association with enemies of the empire. Yet, when subsequent Gentile readers began to interpret the Gospels, their understanding of the Jewish involvement in the crucifixion took a serious and deadly turn. Christians began to blame all Jews for Jesus' crucifixion. And when the full divinity of Christ became normative, the charge against the charge against the Jews was ratcheted higher. Now they were said to be guilty of deicide, of killing God. With the fall of the Roman Empire, Christians would no longer fear the eagle. But the Roman cross would become a Christian instrument by which to denigrate Jews. The New Testament depends upon the Jewish scriptures, but that dependency is presumed rather than expressed. What is presumed can be forgotten, and the fault lines within the New Testament can allow what is forgotten to take a dangerous turn. The unexpressed contents of Paul's letters can invite new readers to understand his thought in ways quite foreign to the convictions of the apostle, and to conclude that Judaism was a legalistic religion. Local issues and debates which color the characters of the Gospels can heighten the opposition between Jesus and his fellow Jews and give the impression that Jesus was against those who were Jewish. Fear of Roman power, which lessened the responsibility of Pilate, can lay Jesus' death at the feet of his own people. When the collection of New Testament writings are read in new circumstances, fault lines can break. At the end of the first century, local church documents were assuming the status of Scripture. They would soon be interpreted by an ever-increasing number of Christians who knew little of their original context, had minimal concern for the Old Testament, and little knowledge of the historical circumstances of Jesus' death. The forgetting and the breaking were about to begin. And if you would like to see how these fault lines broke and the consequences of their fracture, I invite you to join us next week when the title of our lecture will be Marring the Portrait, the First Heretic and His Legacy. Thank you.